Well, thank you, Nick, and it was a pleasure to follow the Vice Mayor after a very inspiring talk, and I think that actually our talks are complementary. So I was reminded that 4 years ago when I spoke at this conference, I don't know how many people were here, but I actually talked about pandemics, and then the pandemic happened. So I definitely am not a oracle, but I hope that this talk will be prescient, that it will lead our community to really contribute to the IPCC report. So I'm going to use this because I don't like to stand behind that. So my goal today in my brief time, if you remember nothing else, is really three things. One, I hope that our community, as Nick says, contributes to the IPCC report. That's the number one thing. I hope to inspire every single one of us to contribute to this very important assessment. That's number one. The second thing is I am going to talk about and give you some examples of how each of us can actually contribute to the report. So I want you to be inspired, and then I want you to know how you can contribute. And then the third thing I'm going to do is give you some very general, and I emphasize general, ideas of the kind of topics that policymakers have told us they would like information on. I'm not going to give specifics on the kind of sensors or algorithms, but more general topics. So that's the goal for the next 30 seconds or 30 minutes or so. So I do have to give a little bit of history, because I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with the IPCC. If you're familiar with the IPCC, can you just raise your hand? Okay, not everyone, maybe like a half or something. So a little bit about the IPCC. It was established in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization, along with the United Nations Environment Program. And its purpose is to provide policymakers with regular assessments of the scientific basis of climate change, its impacts and future risks, and critically, options for adaptation and mitigation. So the purpose of the IPCC is really for national policymakers. Even though now we focus a lot on mayors and regional governments, our primary audience is still national policymakers. And fundamentally, this is really critical too, it's the IPCC assessments, and the IPCC was really designed to contribute to the UN negotiations on climate. So again, this is really about national policymakers. And if we look at the history of the IPCC, we have actually a number of achievements. The first assessment report, which was in 1990, actually led to the establishment of the UNFCCC. The second report and the science there was critical for the input to the development of the Kyoto Protocol. The third assessment report, up until then, a lot of the reports, the first and second report, really focused much more on the scientific basis of climate change. It wasn't until the third assessment report that there was a lot more focus on adaptation. And I would say that this was really an inflection point in international negotiations about climate change. And if we look at the other reports, the fourth assessment was really critical for establishing a 2°C limit and was really the basis for the Kyoto Protocol. And then the fifth assessment report was input for the Paris Agreement. And we only finished the sixth assessment report last year, so who knows how successful it will be. But I put this up here just to illustrate that the IPCC does have tangible impacts on the international policymaking arena. Now, just very quickly, when people talk about the IPCC, we're really talking about three quite different working groups. The first working group focuses on the physical basis of climate change. The second working group focuses on impacts, adaptation, risks, and vulnerability. And then the third working group focuses on how do we actually mitigate climate change. These three working groups work in parallel. There's a little bit of cross-interaction between the three of them, but I want you to keep these three working groups in mind as you think about your own research, because I would argue that everyone in this room, our work could actually contribute to all three of these different working groups. In addition to the three working group reports, every IPCC report also has a series of special reports. I want to emphasize that the special reports have to be approved by the IPCC plenary. What is the IPCC plenary? Okay, the IPCC plenary, or the Intergovernmental Panel, is actually comprised of states of the United Nations. So there are 195 member states, and each of them have a national focal point. So Greece has a national focal point, the US does, etc. So basically the IPCC is comprised of the authors, it's comprised of members of the United Nations, okay? And so the member states have to agree on what the special reports are. So you can imagine the politics that go behind the approval of a special report. And so it's quite, I'm going to give a little bit more history later, but it's quite a coup, I would say, that the IPCC, the plenary, the Intergovernmental Panel, have approved a special report on cities and climate change. Because remember, the audience is national governments. They have approved a special report on cities and climate change. So I want to talk a little bit about the process, because I think this is important so that all of us are clear about the different entry points for contributing to the report. So there are three quite distinct phases of the report, and I think, again, our community can contribute to each of these different phases. The first phase is really preparing the report before we even do any writing. And critical to this is what's called a scoping meeting. So there are about 100-ish people from around the world. They're primarily scientists. We get together and we basically say, we develop the outline for each of the three working groups. And once the outline is developed, the panel actually has to approve the outline. So the 195 representatives of national governments have to approve the outline. So they're basically giving their stamp of approval that these are the topics that they care about. After that, there's a nomination of the authors. This is pretty critical. And then the focal points actually nominate the authors, and then the IPCC Bureau is in charge of selecting the authors. And the selection process is I'm not totally sure how it's done, but they want to make sure that there's regional representation, that it's not just global north, it's global south, we can't have everybody from Greece, et cetera. So it is really supposed to be a global representation of scientists. So for the sixth assessment report, the IPCC received nearly or over 2,800 nominations from around the world, and there were over 780 coordinating lead authors and review editors. So the coordinating lead authors are folks who lead the chapter. They're usually 1 to 3 for every chapter. The lead authors are the core writing team, and then the review editors are in charge of making sure that the chapters respond adequately to each of the reviewer comments. So that's the preparatory phase. At that point, there's a lot of excitement. People have been nominated to be an IPCC author, like, oh, this is gonna be so fun. And then the work starts. So what happens is the authors write the report. There's what's called a first order draft. And this first order draft, I don't know if people in the back can see, I apologize, this is so small. But the first order draft, anybody can register to actually review it. The second order draft is quite different. The second order draft is officially registered and reviewed by governments. And what happens is governments ask their scientists, NEC, others, to actually serve as reviewers. Ordinary citizens can actually apply to be reviewers, NGOs. So it's a variety of different people and organizations that are actually reviewers. And then there's a final draft. So there's a review process, and then the authors have to go back and edit the report and respond to the reviewer comments, just like any peer-reviewed paper. And then at the end of this process, there's a plenary where we meet in person with all the representatives of the 195 member states, and they approve the report. And specifically, when we talk about approving the report, they approve what's called the summary for policymakers, literally line by line. We go through every single word together to approve the report. So for the 6th assessment, we assessed more than 100,000 pieces of scientific literature, and we responded to over 300,000 reviewer comments. I would say this is not so fun. And then the third phase of finishing this report is, as I said, there is this plenary where the report gets approved. And then a lot of the work comes in this later piece, which is really the outreach, where we meet with national governments, we meet with local governments, but a lot of the work happens with national governments, and also increasingly the private sector. Companies and a lot of the private sector want to understand how the report can affect their own decision-making and global strategy about their business. So that's a little bit about the process of the IPCC, and I want to switch now to talking about urban in the IPCC. So up until the 5th assessment report that was published in 2014, there was no standalone chapter on how climate change would affect cities or how cities can mitigate climate change. Instead, cities were seen through the lens of sectors like buildings, transport, land, energy. And what happened was, in about the early 2000s, there were a number of us who kept going to the IPCC and saying, listen, urbanization is one of the biggest trends in the 21st century. IPCC needs to take urbanization seriously. So be careful what you complain about, because suddenly the IPCC said, okay, if you think this is so important, you better lead this chapter on how cities can mitigate climate change. So that was really the first time I ever became involved with the IPCC, was with the 5th assessment report. And so it was the first time there was a standalone chapter on how cities can mitigate climate change. And then there was also the first ever standalone chapter on how cities would be affected by climate change. I really want to emphasize what a big transition this was, because again, you have to remember the IPCC, the panel, are national governments. And for them to approve a report that has a chapter on cities is really a change in their thinking about their national assets, about mitigation strategies. If we fast forward from 2014 to 2022, there have been a lot of changes in the IPCC now in terms of urban. So in the most recent report, the 6th assessment, urban was a focus in each of the 3 working groups. So we had, again, a chapter on how cities can mitigate climate change. And then each of the 3 working groups also produced urban fact sheets. So working group 1 had a fact sheet on the biophysical basis of urban heat island and how climate affects cities. And in the middle of this process, between the 5th assessment and the 6th assessment in 2016, the IPCC approved a special report on cities and climate change in the 7th assessment cycle. So even though at this point in 2016, We hadn't even finished the sixth assessment. They already were looking ahead and thinking that it would be important to have a special report on cities. So, it's now 2023. In July this year, the IPCC will vote on the new chair, the new co-chairs and leaders, the leaders of the IPCC. And after they are voted on, we will get started with the next assessment report. So how can you all get involved? So there are 3 different phases here as well. One way to get involved is directly contributing to the scientific literature. And this is one of my main reasons for flying here, is to inspire all of you to contribute to the literature. And I emphasize here, the assessments are as good as the literature that we assess. We cannot include literature in the IPCC that hasn't been published. Now, it doesn't have to be peer-reviewed anymore. It could be gray literature, and so this is really important. Gray literature is critical because there are a lot of case studies. Maybe Heraklion can be in the next assessment report. Maybe somebody here in this room can write up about the transformation of Heraklion and how remote sensing is actually monitoring changes in emissions. We need a lot more of these gray studies or gray reports because a lot of the case studies actually difficult to trickle up into the peer-reviewed literature. So in preparation for the special report, IPCC organized first time IPCC organized a conference in 2018 called Cities and Climate Change. And what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of the key take-home messages from this conference. So this conference had over 800 participants. And about 1/3 of the participants were stakeholders. They were policymakers, again, a mix of national, regional, and local policymakers, and also scientists. And I encourage you to, I'm going to leave the slides with Nick. I encourage you to go to actually this website. You can download the action agenda, because what we did here was we actually identified the key knowledge gaps that stakeholders and scientists identified. So I know many of us, when we write a paper at the end, we say, we hope this is useful for policymaking. So in this report, we actually identify areas where knowledge gaps would actually be useful for policymaking. Okay, so before I go into the topics that we identified that are critical for the assessment report, I do want to talk a little bit about framing urban systems in the context of climate change. We know that climate change is affecting urban areas through a number of different pathways, extreme heat, precipitation. We also know that reduced yields in other places in rural areas might be contributing to migration in urban areas. So some of the impacts of climate change may not be directly through cities, it may be through other sectors like agriculture. And we know that there's a lot of interest in land-based adaptation. We just heard this from the vice mayor. You know, how can we actually use greening as a way to adapt to climate change and make cities cooler? But at the same time, we know, this community certainly knows, that urban areas also contribute to climate change. And in fact, land cover and land use contribute to almost 1/4 of anthropogenic CO2 emissions. But at the same time, land use is critical for sinks. So land systems are about 30%, or sinks for about 30% of CO2 emissions. And we know that land use and urban form, urban expansion, the materials that are in cities, all of that contribute to climate change. And so what's going to be really critical in terms of the science that we can produce is to think about this entire loop of how cities contribute to climate change, but how climate change can impact cities. And so the framing that I want us to keep in mind is all three of these different working groups. And I can say that, speaking for working group 3, the question that policymakers ask us the most, the number one question they ask us is, what is the evidence that this intervention will reduce emissions? It's not enough to say that urban greening can reduce emissions. They want to know if you plant, well, they haven't asked this specific question, but basically the question is, if you implement this intervention, what are the costs and potentials? Those are the key phrases we use a lot in the IPCC. The costs, it's financial costs, it's human costs. Cities, we know, all have limited financial budgets, national governments do. So what are the costs? And then critically, what are the potentials for reducing emissions? In the last 2 reports, I want to just emphasize, our chapter has not been able to produce numbers on costs and potentials. And that has really reduced the efficacy of the report, or the chapter. The other sectors, the building sector, the transport sector, they have all sorts of estimates of, if you invest this, if you implement this policy, it will reduce emissions by this much. This is an area where I think our community certainly can contribute. If we can actually monitor how interventions that have already been implemented can reduce emissions, we can actually report this in the report. So, what have we done so far as a community that might be useful to the IPCC report? Quickly, I'm going to call this Urban Remote Sensing 1.0. We as a community have largely focused on, I would argue, these kinds of questions. We've looked at things like, how are urban areas changing? How much, where, and why? We have distinguished urban areas from non-urban areas, so urban, non-urban. We've done a great job in mapping urban extent. Yesterday, we heard a number of different talks, local, national, global products now for different time periods. So we've done a really good job doing this. And I think this is what we have to build on. But this is not enough. We did a study out of my lab where we, again, in preparation for the IPCC, we wanted to know what is the urban remote sensing community done to date. And the purpose of that assessment was to identify gaps in knowledge. And so one of the things that we found is that we as a community, we love to study big cities. So if we look at the algorithms that we have developed, 41% of them have focused on cities of 5 million or greater. 80% have focused on cities of 1 million and greater. And I apologize, I don't remember how many people live in Heraklion, but I don't think in the city center there are 1 million people. So a city of this size, which is, I think, very much more representative of cities around the world, we are not studying Heraklion. Maybe you have studied Heraklion, but we need to do many more studies like Heraklion. If we look at where urban population is distributed, 50% of the urban population around the world live in places like this, in cities less than 1 million, but we are not developing algorithms for these types of cities. This is a problem. What have we done so far? 60% of our studies have focused on China or the United States. 75% of the studies that we have published have focused on cities that are, or countries that are either high or upper middle income. Despite a very long archive of Landsat data, MODIS, I'm going to even say AVHRR for older people in the room, 62% of the published studies use only 3 points in time. Most of our studies have focused on binary urban expansion. It's either urban or it's not. Only 13% of the studies we've published focus on inter-urban change or within urban change. That's a problem. I mean, it's been great. We've done a good job. We can pat ourselves in the back, but we need to do a lot more. So what does Urban Remote Sensing 2.0 look like? If we're going to contribute meaningfully to the 7th assessment report. And what I want us to do for the remainder of our time is everything that I say, I hope that you will look at it from the lens of what is the physical basis of climate change? How will climate change affect cities? So that's working group 2. And again, what are the costs and potentials? What are the costs of increasing heat on cities? What are the potential for actually adapting? And I think this is a really big question we need to grapple with. Most of us in the IPCC, maybe I shouldn't say most, many of us in the IPCC have recognized that, or recognizing that we are unlikely to meet the 1.5 degree C target, that we're more likely looking at a 2 degree C world. And in fact, just yesterday, the WMO published a new report showing significantly increasing heat in the next 30 years. So I think part of our job as scientists is to provide policymakers with the science of what can cities actually do to adapt to significantly increasing heat and changes in precipitation. So I'm going to just quickly run through some of the key areas, key topics that policymakers and scientists have identified as key gaps that the special report needs to fill. We need to have a lot more science across cities of different income levels and clearly different city sizes, and especially the global south. I think a number of people, I think Hannes already mentioned this yesterday in his opening remarks. If we look at the distribution of the urban population and urban population growth, we can see, I'm having difficulty operating this, but okay, there we go. We can see that there's just a number of different countries where we don't have sufficient case studies. So despite the importance of China, the US, India, we just need to study a lot more places. The second thing is we absolutely need to study dynamic urban change. It's insufficient to look at 3 points in time or even 5 points in time, because what policymakers want to know is how effective are the interventions. So if we want to understand how effective planting is here in Heraklion in lowering emissions or maybe building energy use, we know the years in which they've built this, green belt, the 100 playgrounds. We should be able to have a lot of highly temporal observations to see, is there a signal in reduced emissions, or is there a signal in cooling buildings? A lot of our conceptualization right now about urbanization is very, very simplistic. Our conceptualization primarily is something like this. The world goes from being forested, or maybe not forested, it's some kind of wild land, it gets cleared, it becomes agriculture, and it's urban. So if we're looking at some kind of vegetation index, we expect that it looks like this. There's this big drop, and that's urban, and that's it. But in reality, we know that some places that are urban, actually, they might get abandoned. Some places actually, once they're urban, they actually continue to get developed, especially in the global south, so there might be intensification. In reality, the urbanization or urban expansion, urban development probably looks something like this. And it's probably much messier than this. And so we need frequent observations to identify how interventions have affected urban areas. And again, using the lenses of working groups 1, 2, and 3, Developing a more complex conceptualization of urbanization will contribute to all three working groups. The third key area that we need to look at is both intra and inter-urban variability. This is really critical if we are to produce a science that helps us understand how cities will be affected or be vulnerable to climate change, because we know that cities are very different. We saw that in Hannes's pictures yesterday. I'm going to show a few slightly different ones. Right now, we develop map products where this is all urban. Not very useful. If we think about Working Group 1 and they need to develop the scientific basis of climate change, we know that whether it's evapotranspiration, surface albedo, very different between this and this. If we think about Working Group 2, risks, vulnerability, and impacts, the impacts of heat and precipitation will be very different here versus here. Not only because of the land use change, not only because of the structure, but clearly because of income, resilience, capabilities, et cetera. And then if we think about mitigation strategies, I'm guessing that emissions here are very low. I'm guessing emissions here are very high. So the mitigation strategies here will be very different than mitigation strategies here. So we need to have a lot more inter and intra-urban variability in order to inform all three working groups. Mitigation strategies are very different here. Vulnerability is here, different here, than for this kind of place, right? So again, I encourage all of us to think about our work in the context of the biophysical basis of climate change, how cities will be affected by climate change, and how cities can mitigate climate change. The fourth big area that we need to focus on is volumetric change. If I was a forester or an ecologist, imagine if I was doing remote sensing to map the world's forests and everything was just green, and I just said this is forest and non-forest, but I didn't measure the height or the width or the volume of forest. That's not very useful. But we as a community, I think, in the last 40 years have largely focused on mapping urban areas in the lateral dimension, right? So it's urban, non-urban, but we don't look at volumetric structure. And this goes beyond just measuring height. It's not just height. It is really the form, the configuration. So those of us who've walked around the city center, right, the narrow streets, our interaction with the building space is very different than if you're along the seafront, right, with a wide boulevard. So it's not just building height, it's really street widths. It's how pedestrians interact with the built environment. So this volume is really critical for all three working groups. We also know, if we think about how climate change will affect cities, we know that urban volume is really strongly correlated with economic activities. So if policymakers want to know how climate change will impact cities, and they want to know cost and potentials, we can start mapping volumetric change and start working with economists to estimate how heat and precipitation might actually lead to reduced productivity, lost jobs, etc. The other thing that's really critical here is that we know that in the next 20 to 30 years, we will be building lots of new cities around the world. And in the fifth assessment report, we concluded that building the cities of tomorrow, the new infrastructure in the global south primarily, it may actually exceed our carbon budget. And so this is perfect for remote sensing. We can start actually monitoring, characterizing the development of the three-dimensional infrastructure around the world. We know that this is Shanghai. We know that places like Shanghai, many of you have seen these photos before. It looks like this today. But it's not just Shanghai and big cities. This is a picture taken from one of my field sites in Nepal. This is Heraklion in the 80s and Heraklion today. So again, I want to emphasize the need to study the smaller, medium-sized cities. Again, through the three lenses of the three different working groups. Scale is a really big issue, and this is something that has come up repeatedly in our discussions, especially with national governments. Because when we produce the report, national governments are going to look at the report from the lens of their government, their country, right? So leaders of Greece are going to be looking at the report and asking, how is this relevant to the cities in Greece? So here are the issues, because we cannot write a report where we are simply summarizing thousands of case studies around the world. So let me just repeat that. It's not going to be helpful if we have a report where we summarize thousands of case studies. What we need to do is we need to synthesize. We need to be able to synthesize like cities, similar cities, develop typologies of cities. What other cities are like Heraklion in terms of its geography, in terms of its budget, in terms of its structure, in terms of its economy? What are the strategies that this city has implemented that could be scaled up to other cities? That's what governments want to know. This is something that comes up a lot at the plenary. National governments say, you know, you developed this report, but it's not that useful for my country. So we need to develop a large set of case studies at the local level, but then we need to be able to synthesize them and compare them and develop syntheses, assessments of case studies that are similar, cities that can learn from each other. And I want to just emphasize this point here. A lot of times the local case studies cannot be extrapolated in other places, and national governments are aware of that. So if we have a case study of, let's say, New York, other countries that are not Americans will say, well, we're not like New York. We don't have the finance capabilities of New York. We're not as big as New York. So we need to think about examples that could be scaled up and extrapolated into other places. And again, using the three working group lens. This is something that has come up a lot, informality. And one of the things that I've learned, I'm very surprised at with Heraklion, is learning that there's so much development in the city that is illegal, apparently. Surprised to hear that. You wouldn't expect that here. But this is something that many national governments have indicated they need to know a lot more about, because apparently informality is an issue all around the world. And it's not just about informal settlements. I just want to emphasize that. It's not just about slums and informal settlements. Governments have said they want to understand informality, illegal building, because if they need to understand who is at risk to extreme heat and they don't have information on who lives there, it's very difficult to identify strategies for hazard mitigation or otherwise. So informality is really, really critical. And partly it's about informal settlements, but not only about informal settlements. And again, here, there's a lot of interest in understanding what are solutions that can be scaled up to other places, especially with regard to adaptation. Again, needing to look at all three case studies, or all three working groups. The last and final key area that policymakers have indicated they want us to have a much larger literature on is, what are the costs and potentials of blue and green infrastructure? So thousands of cities, we just saw these great examples here, but thousands of cities around the world are implementing blue and green infrastructure. we should be able to couple what cities are doing with remote sensing to give them estimates of the cost of these strategies and their potentials, both for mitigation as well as adaptation. So whether it's green roofs or bioswales or urban greening. So again, this is, I think, a big area where we can contribute, combining what we are doing with remote sensing and partnering with cities, because again, lots of cities are already developing these innovation strategies. One other thing that I want to emphasize here is so I've now been involved with the IPCC for 15 years. I've talked to lots of national governments, lots of national policymakers. I've never had a policymaker say that climate change mitigation is the hook for a strategy. The strategies are usually because of economic competitiveness. Maybe it's for tourism, right? Or maybe it's for human health. And so the more that we can couple our studies with economic competitiveness or human health, the more that we are providing scientific information that is policy relevant. Again, needing to look through the lens of all three working groups. So, where are we now? Where do we need to go? How can you actually help? So, I've just given you some examples of topics that you can work on in the next 5 years that will be critical for AR7. But there's another area where you can help, and that is by synthesizing the published literature. This is the total number of scientific publications on climate change as identified through the Web of Science. And you can see, so the red is for the first assessment report, this is the fifth assessment. You can see this significant increase in the literature. Back in the first, second, and third assessment reports, it was possible for us as the author team to actually, I wasn't part of it then, but it was possible to read the literature. But now there's so much literature that it's very difficult to keep track of everything. And in fact, if we look and see what percentage of the published literature are we actually assessing, this is very interesting. So on the left is the total number of publications as identified in Web of Science, and on the right is the publications that were included in the IPCC report. And you can see that the percentage here, so this is calculated as a percentage here. In the first assessment report, we assessed more than 60% of the published literature. In the fifth assessment report, we only assessed about 22% of the published literature. This should be alarming to us because we are publishing things that we want to be policy relevant, but it's not making it to one of the biggest stages to be policy relevant. So how can you help? You can help by developing synthesis papers, assessment papers. So this is a little bit of a conceptual framework to think about the IPCC reports. We build on individual research papers, so all of our individual papers. There are a number of different review papers and meta-analyses that we use that synthesize the literature, and then the IPCC assessment is up here. So we could look at the individual papers individually, or we could also look at these synthesis studies. So here's some examples of different syntheses. So we developed one on a meta-analysis of global urban expansion. There have been others on urbanization's impact on rainfall, 1.5 degrees C and climate change, health co-benefits. I encourage you, all of you, to think about meta-analyses or synthesis papers that you could write, because that would make our report even more impactful, because it means then that we are more likely to include a larger percentage of the published literature. The other thing you can do is to propose, organize, and lead special issues. So science had this special issue. PLOS One's had special issues. I think this is really critical to do in your regions, in your countries, because we need to start aggregating up the body of knowledge that has been developed out there. The other thing you can do is organize conferences and workshops and panels, special panels. And if you organize a workshop, you organize a special panel, I encourage you to try to get the panelists to then write a paper synthesizing the literature. So the IPCC, we organized this meeting, and then we published a proceedings document that tells the community these are the areas that we need to focus on. So those are the ways that you can get involved. You can publish papers on specific topics, you can propose special issues, you can write meta-analyses. I'm happy to talk to you about any of these. And encourage you, give you feedback, or however I could help. But the other thing that you can do is simultaneously offer yourself as a volunteer to the IPCC. So you can go to the IPCC website. It's not open yet, but soon, after they elect the new leaders, soon, once we get the AR7 assessment going on the report, on the website, there's a place where you can go. There's information here on how to apply, who is your focal point, how is the selection done. I've already told you how that works. And then lots of videos from authors that tell you how fun it is. Don't believe any of it. Okay? It is an incredibly rewarding experience, I will say that. And you work with brilliant people from around the world, but you're a volunteer. So don't think that you can get out of teaching or mentoring your students or stop writing papers or grants or anything else, or, you know, collaborating with the mayor. You still have to do all those things and then figure out how you're going to write the report. But I encourage all of you to think about it, or nominate someone that you don't like to be an IPCC author, okay? Because we need you. I'm really serious. We really need you, because you all are producing the science that's going in the special report. So you are in a best position to assess the literature. Okay, if you don't want to be an author or a review editor, you can volunteer to be an expert reviewer. Now, when you volunteer to be an expert reviewer, you volunteer in a number of capacities. You can be the official Greek reviewer for the Greek government or the German government or whatever. You could also be just a normal person from your university or organization. You just have to register. Your remarks, your reviewer comments will be attributed to you. So I will know that Hannes wrote this about my chapter. You can volunteer to be a reviewer for a chapter or any number of chapters. You can volunteer to be a reviewer for all the chapters and do a search for any place that says urban and just read that, okay? We need reviewer comments, because I think all of us know our papers are only as good as the reviewer comments. And most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, the reviewer comments make our papers better. So imagine 300,000 comments. It will make the report even better. Okay, so 4 years ago I showed this picture. I talked about pandemics, and then I showed this picture. So this is what happens at the end of the report, before the pandemic. So this is in 2014. These are the country delegates, and they're the negotiators. They come with their delegations. And what happens is the coordinating lead authors, the leaders of each chapter, We go up there and we bring up our section of the summary for policymakers, and we go line by line, word for word, and it gets approved. It's a very complicated process, but you learn a lot. It is basically, imagine if you meet the worst reviewers of your papers live, and you have to respond to them live. But it's very interesting because you get to see how what the governments care about. I might have said this 4 years ago, and you might not remember, so I'm going to say to you now again. So this was the first plenary that I was involved with, and I was very nervous. I had no idea what to expect. I reread the chapter so many times. I reread many of the most controversial papers. I was ready to answer very difficult science questions. But did I tell you what the first question I was asked? Do you remember? Very close. The question that was asked, and I won't tell you what government it was, but it was in Greece. The first question I was asked was, why should national governments care about cities? This is a report for national governments. Why should we care about cities and what they can do to mitigate climate change? It was not what I was expecting. So this is what it looks like. It is a little intimidating. The Saudis have are there anyone from Saudi Arabia here? They have the largest delegation, at least for Working Group 3. Okay, fast forward to last year. This is what the plenary looked like. We had it on Zoom. We have the report here. We still have to go line by line. And then the country delegates, they're Saudi Arabia, the country delegates get to raise their hands. But what was really interesting is instead of asking about why countries should care about cities, the questions were so different. The questions were, what can we do to adapt to climate change? How much is this going to cost? What can we do to mitigate climate change? How much is this going to cost? So I just want to emphasize that national governments clearly recognize that cities are sites of innovation, they're central for economic productivity in their countries, and they want to protect these assets. So I hope that I have inspired you to work on research that can contribute to the IPCC report, and that you will also volunteer yourself to be an IPCC author in the next assessment. So thank you, and if I have time, I'm happy to answer questions.